Hey everybody, Celerity here, bringing you my first in a series of Brotato guides designed to help you win, and more importantly, help you understand the game, and hopefully enjoy the game as much as I do. For context, I've been playing since the demo version and clocked in several hundred hours, winning and win streaking with every character in the game on the highest difficulty. I'm not saying I'm the best, but I hope to bring enough knowledge to the table to get you started. A little forewarning, this guide is intended to be thorough. As a result, it might be a little dry, or it may cover topics that you already understand. There's a lot of theory crafting and math in here. It's just the nature of the beast. Brotato is a very math-heavy game. Towards the end, we've also got some quick and dirty info on build suggestions to get your first few wins, and I've provided timestamps so you can jump to any point that might interest you. So, first of all, what is Brotato? A run is divided into 20 waves that you'll need to survive for a certain length of time. The composition of each wave is roughly the same from run to run, so you know what to expect. This means if you know all the enemy types, you get to plan ahead and build around what you might need in the near future. Wave 20 contains a boss, which you can either survive like the other waves, or kill to instantly win the run. Either way, a win is a win, so you can build damage or survivability, whichever you choose. Additionally, on higher difficulties, you'll have Horde waves, which are just super dense waves with extra enemies, and Elite waves, which contain a mini-boss enemy that you can kill for extra loot. I do plan on making a detailed wave guide that will cover every single enemy and Elite, how to dodge them, how to prepare for them, etc. So feel free to subscribe and stay tuned for that if you want more info on the waves themselves. Now, killing enemies will drop materials. This material is kind of like your experience and your money. The game will sometimes use the term material interchangeably to mean experience and money, so try not to get too confused. Just know that when you pick up material, you get the experience for it at the end of the wave, and then you can spend it in the shop. If you don't pick up the material in the wave, you'll notice that it goes into a bag and gets dropped into the next wave as bigger X2 bonus materials. So the first few enemies that you kill will drop these X2 materials, and you always want to pick these up, because if you don't pick them up, there's no X3, you won't roll over into an even bigger material. So you always want to pick up the big materials at the start of the wave. At the end of every wave, you'll level up if you got enough experience, pick a random level up stat, and then head to the most fun part of the game, the shop. We won't get super in-depth talking about shop strategy right now, but the shop basically works like this. You get a selection of 4 random items or weapons, and they can be re-rolled by paying a cost. The re-roll cost increases each time you do it, but this cost will reset in the next shop, so don't be afraid to re-roll a few times to get what you need. Also, if you buy all 4 items in the shop, the re-roll will be free, it'll restock for 0. Brotato, just like real life, features inflation, so the cost of items will go up over time. But you can circumvent this if you lock an item, saving it to buy in the next shop or whenever you feel ready. The cost won't go up on the locked item, and in fact, the cost of a reroll is often lower than the cost of inflation, meaning sometimes you want to reroll even if you don't have the money to buy something right now. You can reroll for 3, lock an item that costs 50, and actually save money compared to the 55 or so that it would cost you if you found it later. Just keep in mind, locking an item takes up space in the shop, so you won't see as many new items, so try not to keep stuff locked for too long if you can help it. One other really important thing to know is the first 2 shops will always roll with exactly 2 weapons and 2 items. Since getting your weapons online and upgraded is really important, a common strategy is to roll hard on these first 2 shops to get a lot of duplicate weapons early. Let's say Slingshot, for example, is a very good upgraded weapon since it adds more bounces. So if I were going for a Slingshot build, I would probably roll really hard for those 2 weapon slots, try to get as many Slingshots as possible. Shops 3 to 5 also guarantee 1 weapon each. The game tends to give you more of the weapon types you already have, so if you want to stay focused, try not to branch into too many weapon sets, or you may find it hard to upgrade your weapons. On to stats. Stats. Brotato is a game all about stats. I know a lot of you might be getting bored and wanting me to talk about dodging and moving and shooting stuff, and we will in future guides a little bit, but A, it's harder to talk about movement than it is about strategy, and B, you can beat the game even with crap movement if you understand how to build your character. Brotato really is like 80% strategy game, so if this guide feels a bit dry or theory craft heavy, I apologize, but it's really important to understand all the stats and figure out how to combine them for your perfect build. I will say future guides will be a little lighter, focusing more on item tiers, character differences, enemy preparation, things like that. But we need to crawl before we can run. So let's get into it. Alright, so starting off with the offensive stats. Damage percent and attack speed are your pretty universal DPS stats. They just increase your overall damage and how fast you attack by a certain percent. You usually want a good mix of both. While I think attack speed is a little better overall since it reduces your downtime on your swings or your shots, it's worth noting that damage percent applies to all non-construct damage, not just your weapons. So if you have a damaging character passive like Lucky, or some extra damage sources like Rip and Tear, etc., then damage percent will work on those while attack speed obviously won't. But overall, try to keep the two stats pretty similar. Quick example on how you would calculate this. Let's say I'm dealing base 100 damage per second. If I had 100 attack speed, I'll attack twice as fast, so now it's 200 damage per second. With 100 damage percent instead, again, we go from 100 to 200 damage per second, right? 100% extra damage. But consider if I add 50 of each stat instead of 100 of one of the stats, we will now have 225 damage per second. Makes sense, right? So keep them balanced. Now we have to talk about flat damage, or more accurately, type-based scaling damage, which sounds a lot worse. So I call it flat damage, but some people might call it type damage, base scaling damage, or whatever. I don't think there's a clear name for it. Just as long as you're not confused, it basically means plus damage that's specific to melee, ranged, and elemental types, the three main damage types in the game. This is the primary stat that all of your damage is based on, so as an example, let's look at the Humble Fist. Fist is a very simple weapon, scales with 100% of your melee damage stat. And it's also got some base damage, of course, like every weapon does. So, with the 8 base damage, if you had 0 melee damage, it would hit for 8. If you had 4 melee damage, it would hit for 12. And if you had somehow -7 melee damage, it would only hit for 1. So, it's pretty simple. But you can see that not every weapon is created equal, like my friend the Fist. Some of them have great scaling, and some not so much. As an example, like the Thief Dagger here, little lower scaling because it gets you materials, so it's naturally not going to scale quite as hard. And if you look at the guns, you'll see some pretty silly stuff, like the laser gun. You know, you're looking at like 600% range damage scaling. Got the minigun, 1250% range damage scaling on the DPS. The SMG. And this is primarily why guns are meta right now as of recording this video, because you can just reach some really silly damage numbers. And it's just important to know that, you know, while the SMG might scale with an insane 533% of my range damage every second, the slingshot doesn't, right? The slingshot actually keeps about the same range scaling throughout all of its upgrades. And as a result, it's not quite as important to build range damage for a slingshot. So it's just good to know these numbers in general. So yeah, what does that mean for you? Basically, flat damage is going to be highly dependent on the weapon and character choice. Some builds don't need it at all, while for others it's their most important stat. We'll have to cover it more in depth in the character videos and item videos, but just keep in mind that the basic formula is base damage plus flat damage times damage percent times attack speed. And you usually want a mix of all three in order to achieve as much damage as possible. Next, we'll briefly go over crit chance. Crit is a chance to hit for bonus damage, usually double, but can be different, again, depending on the weapon or the attack. If you notice, every weapon has its own base crit chance and crit multiplier, and some items can crit as well. Most weapons will have very low base crit chance. Some have 1%, 3%, like that's pretty common. But precise weapons tend to have a higher percent. But that's their base crit chance, and then your crit chance is added to that. There are some great items that scale off of crit, like Tentacle and Hunting Trophy. And again, precise weapons tend to be built around crits with conditional effects and huge crit multipliers. For example, Shuriken, that bounces every time you crit, and the Knife, which doesn't do anything special, but has an insane 4x crit multiplier, meaning you hit 4 times as hard whenever you crit with a red knife. In general, though, unless you have a high crit multiplier weapon or a ton of damage percent already built, crit chance isn't the most efficient damage stat, and you can take it negative for no penalty. So I'd usually recommend avoiding crit and using the free negative to stack items like Compass, Goat Skull, and Metal for no downside. Finally, engineering. The only offensive stat that's treated separately from the others. That's because turrets only benefit from engineering to do damage. They don't scale off your damage percent or attack speed, and they can't crit. So engineering builds pretty much only want engineering for damage, maybe a little bit of attack speed or melee to swat enemies away more effectively, since you do actually have weapons on an engineer. They're just not your focus. If you're playing on a non-engineering build, you probably want to ignore the stat, but the turret items are pretty good on their own. Pencils and books are cheap unless you're starting university, and a lot of good items just happen to come with engineering on them, so you might end up with an engineering sub-theme sometimes. And a couple of weapons do scale with engineering, namely the screwdriver and plank. Alright, on to the defensive stats. So max HP is the simplest stat. If you take this much damage, you die. You probably figured this one out on your own. Let's move on. Speed, another really simple stat. It makes you move faster. 1% faster per point of speed. I would say most characters want around 20 speed for the early elites and 40 for the boss wave, but you can certainly win runs without any speed if your other stats are good enough, so this is really kind of a luxury stat that you take if you can. Dodge, it's a stat that will let you prevent all incoming damage X% of the time. Armor, instead, will always reduce incoming damage by a certain percent. I have a lot that I want to say about defenses in Brotato, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. I started writing about it in this video and realized this is going to take a while, so let's put a pin in that. Just give you the TLDR for now, until maybe I'll come out with a video in the future that explains a little more mathematical nuances of how defense works and how much you should prioritize it. But the TLDR, armor is good to get to about 15 or 20, and dodge is often taken as high as you can get it, similar to speed. Treat it kind of like a luxury extra stat, or just ignore it fully because negative dodge is not detrimental, and you can stack items like acid and weird food with no repercussions. Now, some healing stats. HP regen gives you passive healing of 1 HP every so often, with more HP regen meaning you heal faster. It's a decent stat. For most builds, it'll be your most efficient method of healing. One way to look at it is 10 HP regen gives you 30 HP over a 30-second wave. So it's a little more efficient than just building raw HP, but of course it doesn't let you soak those big hits that just having more max HP does. Lifesteal. This gives all your attacks a percentage chance to heal 1 HP each. You can only trigger it once every 0.1 seconds. This is important because it tends to be good for weapons that have a lot of piercing or extra projectiles, but bad for melee weapons, because a melee weapon will hit every enemy in its range at the exact same time. That means even if you have 100% lifesteal, you'll only be healing for 1 on each melee swing, regardless of how many enemies you hit. But if you're using a shotgun with a bunch of projectiles that pierce and hit enemies at different times, you might trigger the lifesteal 5 to 6 times in one shot alone. Of course, having fast attack speed also makes lifesteal a lot better. Note that like dodge and crit chance, lifesteal can go negative with no drawback, so you can abuse negative lifesteal to stock up on items like banner and plant. I'll be doing a deep dive into lifesteal versus HP regen in a future video because it's a pretty interesting topic. Now on to some utility stats that don't really have a place in the other categories. Range adds itself to the range of any ranged weapons you're carrying, and half as much to melee weapons. It'll also slow melee weapon attack speed by about 2 to 3% per 100 range, but I wouldn't worry about that too much. Melee weapons should prioritize range heavily since it allows each of your swings to hit more enemies, and it lets you stay at a safer distance to avoid being hit. Most ranged weapons don't actually care too much about it, although it becomes more powerful with piercing weapons to make sure you're always getting value out of that extra pierce. Luck. The way item RNG works is for each wave there's a % chance for a shop item to be blue, purple, or red, tier 2, 3, or 4. Luck multiplies that chance by X%. So if you have 100 luck, you're twice as likely to find higher tier items. If you have 200 luck, you're 3 times as likely. But the same is true for level ups, healing fruits that drop from enemies, and loot crates. It's actually a pretty effective healing stat, and it's usually my favorite healing stat since it also gives me better loot in the process. Harvesting, this gives you a set amount of materials and experience per wave, and it gains 5% interest every wave. So if you have 100 harvesting, that's plus 100 materials and experience for you at the end of the wave, and next wave it'll grow to give you plus 105. It's a pretty solid greed stat. I think it's a bit weaker than luck overall, and not something that I'm usually prioritizing. However, you can see that if you get a ton of harvesting early, you can make it snowball and pretty much ride it to victory. Alright, so now let's talk about stat weight or stat distribution. Not all stats are created equal. Plus 1 range damage is a lot better than plus 1 max HP, for example. This is intuitive, but let's look at the level ups to see how the game balances its stats. I like to look at blue level ups because those are usually what you're taking after the first few levels, and they give us a good baseline. Once we look at this, we can give items a value and decide whether the items are good or not. This is the basis of all your decisions in Brotato, So it's really important. You don't need to memorize the exact numbers, just kind of have an idea in your head of how important each stat is relative to each other, since you're always going to be choosing one stat over another, and there's always an opportunity cost of if I take this stat, I'm giving up this other stat, right? So according to our model of the blue level ups, this is how the stats are weighted. You can see that basically for every ranged or elemental damage, being the most valuable tier here, or armor, that's in the most valuable tier, for each one of those, you could get 15 range, for example. And everything else is in the middle. Now, again, you don't need to memorize these stats. In fact, forget you ever saw these stats, because I'm about to flip them, about to invert them to the opposite value, using max HP as the baseline, and everything else is inverted from that. All right, so we flip the values, and we've now got our inverted values, which will let us assign values to items based on what stats are actually attached to them. So, in other words, for every 1 max HP on an item, it gets +1. For every 1 ranged damage on an item, it gets +3. And this is like the system that we use to evaluate items, and it's based on the level up upgrades that are in the game, and this is basically what the dev has said these stats are worth, and we're gonna go and use that as a baseline for item valuation. So you can see, but let's start with the charcoal. So charcoal has +1 elemental damage, that's 3, +2 melee damage, also 3, and -2 harvesting, which is -1.5. So that would be a 4.5 value item. And of course, every item has its own cost. In addition to the tier, like they also have a cost, so not every tier 1 item costs the same. But this would be a 4.5 value item at 20 materials. You also have to consider that you might not need all the stats, right? You might not need the elemental damage. So if I only wanted to buy this for the melee damage, well, in that case, I'd have to change the value a little bit. I'd have to remove 3. And in that case, it would only be worth 1.5, which is pretty bad, right? So you probably wouldn't buy it only for one of the damage types. You would probably only want to buy it if you use both damage types, or if you're really desperate for one damage type or another. So that's kind of how we start evaluating items and figuring out what's worth it. Now, if we look up here at the cake is 3 max HP, that's +3, and -1 damage, that's -7.5. So that would be a 2.25 value item. Again, pretty low. However, the cake is also priced low. Priced half as much as something like the hedgehog is 30. The hedgehog has +2 melee damage, +1 range damage, -1 HP regen. This is actually very similar to the charcoal, isn't it? So it's going to be +6 and then -2, actually leaving it with lower value than charcoal, even though it costs more. So 4 value, and our cake was 2.25, right, for half the price. So we're staying pretty in line here. We can see that there is a clear valuation. Now, melee range damage tend to be better together than melee and elemental damage usually, so I guess that's why hedgehog's price is a little higher. And then we get to coffee, +10% attack speed, that is +6, and -2 damage, that is -1.5 again. So 4.5 value for the same values, the same price as the cake. That's insane. It's got essentially the same stat line value as a hedgehog, but it's half the price. That's why coffee is bought almost all the time, in real life and in the game. It's really interesting. You know, I haven't really gone over these numbers until today, but the values do tend to track with my personal experience, that the items with a higher item value using this system tend to be the items that I buy all the time, because they're just really good value. Coffee is pretty much always good value. And I was going to give the opposite example, the helmet, which is +1 armor, that's 3, and -2 speed, that's -2. Absolutely terrible. 1. The value is 1. Absolutely terrible. It costs more than coffee. There's almost no build that doesn't want speed either. There are a couple characters that don't care about speed, but in general, you know, speed's a stat you always want, armor's a stat you always want, which makes this item really hard to recommend. You know, unless you're desperate for the armor, it's going to be really bad value every time. So this is just a way for you to understand the stats and evaluate the items kind of on your own without the benefit of experience. I think if you have experience, you will intuitively know this stuff. But it's just a good way to compare the stats and understand that some stats are better than others. Now, I personally would change some of these values. I would devalue some of the stats that are easier to acquire, cheaper to acquire, because of course, if a stat is pretty much free on a lot of low tier items, then it's going to be worth less than a stat that's really rare or has a lot of downsides attached to it. So this is kind of my revised valuation. And again, you don't need to memorize this, but I would put lifesteal significantly lower. And that means, by the way, that I usually wouldn't take lifesteal as a level up. Because remember, our first model was using the level ups as our baseline. So I think lifesteal is pretty common on items and pretty easy to build on items. And as a result, I would rather buy it on items than take it in level ups. I would rather get the lifesteal from my items and then use my level ups for stuff that I find more valuable. So for instance, with this model saying the lifesteal is 2x, that means a blue lifesteal level up is only worth 4 according to my valuation. Whereas let's say a blue range damage level up is worth 6 according to this valuation. So in fact, I think all the level ups are worth 6 in the base valuation. So I would usually not take lifesteal as a level up stat. The other things I'm devaluing are HP regeneration. I think it's also pretty easy to buy and a little bit overrated. Attack speed. I raised attack speed up because I think attack speed and damage percent are about equal. I lowered harvesting a little bit because I don't focus on it very much. And I actually swapped crit chance and speed, because most builds don't need crit chance, and in fact, like I said, you can go negative in crit chance for no penalty, whereas every build needs a little bit of speed, and it tends to be that, well, it's a bit of a weird case where actually crit chance is kind of hard to build on items. If you have a crit build, then the crit chance priority goes way up, but that's the cool thing about these sort of charts, is for every character, for every run you're doing, this is going to change, right? The priorities change. And that's the great thing about Brotato, these priorities change in real time. So when you have a ton of range damage, you don't really want more. You want damage percent instead. These priorities are gonna shift, and you need to evaluate how much do I need this one stat versus another. If I feel like damage percent is currently 3 times as important as usual, then I'm gonna evaluate it at like a 2.25 instead of the 0.75. So yeah, these numbers tend to change. Also, elemental damage, I lowered it a little bit because there are a lot of really good elemental items. These numbers might change. I just kind of threw these together as my general impression, but don't take it like a Bible or anything, just a general guideline. But I wanted to give you an example of how I think about these things and why I put lifesteal lower. And it's because lifesteal items are really good. So one example would be Whetstone. It's probably the best lifesteal item. It has 4% lifesteal on it, which is a whopping, if we're using the original chart, it's a whopping plus 12 value for a blue item. Absolutely insane. Like no other blue item approaches that kind of value. And minus 3 knockback, which it's not really a stat we talked about. It's basically just how much you push back the enemies when you hit them. Now, I'm not going to say knockback is an irrelevant stat. It is okay, but it's not a stat that you're usually going to prioritize or usually going to miss. If you kill the enemies, they get knocked back by virtue of dying. So you don't really usually need to focus on knockback. The builds that tend to take this are gun builds. So if your damage is low, I can see losing the knockback on something like a minigun or SMG can hurt you for sure. But in general, I think you can afford to miss it, and it's not worth that much. So this is still like a 10 value item or something. Similarly, Ritual. Ritual has no downside in most builds. If you're building damage percent, you're probably not building engineering. So in most builds, this is just a solid, again, 2 lifesteal. In the original model, 2 lifesteal is worth 6 and damage is worth 4.5. So that would be 10.5 value on this item with no downside. That's also huge, right? You're seeing the item values are coming to play here. It shows you when something has that much value on it, it's a really, really good item. And because these items are only tier 2, they're easy to find. You're usually going to end up with a few of them and be able to stack lifesteal to a good amount to where I don't think you need to prioritize them in level ups or in general. Another good item would be like the Butterfly. Any build other than Elemental, this is just a free 2% lifesteal, again 6 value on a tier 1. And the Bat, which is plus 6 value for the lifesteal and just minus 2 harvesting, not too big of a downside, especially late game. Actually, we can do a quick comparison here to show why why Bat is so good and Blood Leech is so bad, because the Blood Leech, in comparison to the Bat, it adds 2 HP regen and takes away 4 extra harvesting, right? Now, 2 HP regen, we know, according to the chart, it's not worth as much as lifesteal, plus 4 on the original chart. And minus 4 harvesting, obviously, is worth more than minus 2, we know that. So you're getting less upside and more downside compared to the Bat, which is crazy. And it costs more. So yeah, Blood Leech is very bad. It needs a buff. Maybe by the time you've seen this video, it has a buff. I don't know. But it's just a good example of how you can use item values to tell yourself that this item is bad. Like, you wouldn't need me to tell you that this item is bad if you just added up the numbers and compared it to some of the other white items. You would already know. In addition to that, Finn and Mouse are both really good. I was going to say Mouse is really good. Finn is really good, and I pretty much always buy it. Mouse is very good in builds that don't care about the extra enemies. You know, if you don't care about the extra enemies, just 5% lifesteal, fantastic. But you do need a good amount of damage to mitigate that. So yeah, there are a lot of really good ways to get lifesteal compared to other stats. You know, I'm not going to go over all of the stats here. I just wanted to give you this quick example of how I evaluate stats and how the excess lifesteal in the item pool really dilutes the value of it in my mind and makes me prioritize it less, because I know I'm going to get some of these items that have it if I really need it. Alright, so we talked about stats and items and the efficiency of stats on items. Now let's talk about weapons a little bit. Upgrading weapons is a little bit simpler because upgrading a weapon just makes it a little bit better at what it already does. And what we want to do is measure exactly how much better. How much better is the weapon compared to its previous tier, and is it worth it for me to invest to upgrade it for that much increase, right? So let's look at the fist first. We're going to assume 30 melee damage. That's a good kind of mid-game melee damage value. So the fist would do 38 damage per hit. But more importantly, we want to look at this third column, which takes attack speed into account. And that'll show us how much damage it does over time. That's more important than, you know, the per hit damage. We want to know how much damage the weapon does over the course of time. And the fist does 10 DPS base plus 128% of our melee damage, which is going to be 30, 38, 39. So we're going to call this 49 damage per second. And if we upgrade to blue, it's going to gain about 11 damage base per second and another 8% of our melee damage. So that's not a lot of extra damage from the scaling. It's only like 2.4. And you'll notice, like, the more damage, more flat damage, I should say, that you have, the less important upgrading your weapons is in general. If I had 1,000 melee damage somehow, then I wouldn't even notice the difference between white and blue and purple, because the scaling doesn't increase that much, right? It's primarily the base damage that increases. So if you have really low flat damage, then upgrading your weapons is fantastic. There are some builds that don't really focus on flat damage at all and just have a lot of like damage percent and attack speed. In that case, upgrading the weapons is really, really good, and it's going to give you a bigger increase. And conversely, if you have a ton of flat damage and not a lot of damage percent or attack speed, then upgrading the weapons is less good. So that's one rule to go by. But in this example, the damage increase we get from white to blue is about 30%. It's a little under 30%. And that sounds really good. That sounds like a big number. But keep in mind, you've got 6 weapons. So if all of your weapons are doing equal work, then that means you're only getting about a 5% total increase to your DPS. Still decent, but you could also build a damage percent stat. You could buy a damage percent item, and it might give you more damage than upgrading your weapon, right? So going from white to blue, as a general rule, going from white to blue is always worth it. It's very cheap. Remember that these have different costs going up. Every weapon has a different cost, and every tier is, you know, increasingly more expensive. White to blue, pretty much automatic. There's almost no build where I would say stay at white. Blue to purple, a little more situational. I would say still usually worth it. But again, you do have to examine those factors. You know, do I have a ton of flat damage? Is my weapon good to upgrade? You'll have to think about it. Is my weapon cheap? Like, the fist is really cheap. So in the case of the fist, I would go to red because the fist is so cheap to upgrade all the way to red. I would say it's a pretty easy weapon to upgrade. But, you know, you're gonna have to examine these factors for yourself, because the upgrades get more expensive, and also late game, you get offered a lot more high value, like purple and red items that have really good item efficiency, and you're going to have to weigh those stats versus the cost of upgrading your weapon. And in many cases, just taking the stats is better, especially if you're lacking in defensive stats. which, you know, upgrading a weapon can't replicate necessarily. Or if you're playing a character who, for example, needs a lot of harvesting and gains a lot from harvesting, maybe you would want to skip some upgrades to get the greed going. So that could be one thing to consider. And then from purple to red, I would say very rarely. I would say there are certain weapons that we're going to discuss in a second here that really do value the red upgrades. But in most builds, I think you're going to be good just staying at like the purple range, maybe half blue, half purplish. I think that's a good area to be, and then you can get a ton of stats, and you won't mind the lack of upgrade. But let's discuss some weapons that really do want to be upgraded. I would call these vertical weapons, as in, you know, if you play Civilization like I do, like tall builds versus wide builds. So these are weapons that want to be built tall, that really, you know, want to suck up all the upgrades and be like your one carry weapon. So a good example is ethereal weapons. Ethereal weapons, they scale better when they are higher rarity. So if you're doing an ethereal build, you start with a ghost axe or ghost flint, and for me, I usually end up with 1 red of each in the build. And that one, you know, ethereal weapons don't do as much damage as other weapons, but at red, they're pretty respectable, and you'll probably just keep it the entire run. So yeah, ethereal weapons, very high priority to upgrade. Also, engineering weapons, for example, the screwdriver and the wrench. You can see that they gain, well, at least from blue to purple, screwdriver gains 50% effectiveness. And from purple to red, it gains 100% effectiveness. Actually, twice as good. Anything that inherits more than like 30 to 40% increase is a high priority. Like, we calculated the fist to do about 30% more per upgrade. And most weapons are going to be in that range. Maybe a little higher, maybe 30, like I said, 35%. But, you know, screwdriver's 50% and then 100%. So massive gains from upgrading. It's also pretty cheap as a weapon. Wrench is similar. You can't really compare because wrench creates different turrets at different levels. But the explosive turret is like much better than the other turrets. So definitely one that you want to upgrade. Another good example of a tall weapon, literally, is the spear. The spear does not gain that much damage, actually. And I haven't calculated it. I would guess that it's less than the fist. I guess it's probably only like 20-some% damage increase from level to level. However, what the spear does gain is range. And it's 25 range from white to blue and blue to purple. But remember, on melee weapons, building range is half as effective. So if I built 25 range, it would actually only translate to 12.5 range on a spear. I would have to build 50 to get 25 range on a spear. So this is effectively 50 range stat from getting this 25. And we know from our item efficiency chart before that 50 range is worth roughly 7.5% damage. And that's about right. Spear is a weapon that wants to build range really aggressively. Spear benefits a lot from range because of the way it attacks. So it's a high value stat on a spear. And yeah, that's really good. I mean, the increase in the 7.5% damage increase for the spear on top of the whatever 25% increase that it'll get from upgrading makes it actually a pretty high priority. But more importantly, at red, it gets an extra 100 range. And 100 range is absurd. So like, it's pretty good going from white to blue to purple. And then at red, it just explodes. It becomes your best weapon. So in general, if I was doing a spear build, I would recommend probably taking them all to blue and then take one of them to red. You know, instead of upgrading them all evenly, which is what I would usually recommend. I would usually recommend upgrading evenly because that's the most cost efficient. But yeah, in the spear's case, you just want one red spear and then make another red spear, and you just want to make them all red, red, red. Same thing with engineering weapons and ethereal weapons too. So some other weapons that benefit a lot from upgrades. We can look at the slingshot. Slingshot gains bounces on upgrade, so every upgrade gives an extra bounce. That's going to raise its effectiveness a lot more than just the numbers that you can see here. The rare weapons tend to, for example, minigun goes from 555% scaling to 1250% scaling, so it's actually more than twice as good, I believe. It does more than double damage going from purple to red. So one of the rare it also gains piercing. So it's actually one of the rare cases where you get where having a red weapon is better than having 2 purples of the weapon. Even if you could have a 7th weapon slot and have 2 purple miniguns, it would be better to have a red minigun. That's really, really rare. So that's another example there. And then any burn weapon, any weapon that has burn on it, either the torch, the wand, and the reason for that is that burn damage does not stack. So as good a time as any to mention that burn damage doesn't stack. And if you're playing a build that has some kind of burn component, you're usually just going to have 1 or 2 high upgraded burn weapons, and they're inflicting the biggest burn. And anything below that burn, like with Scared Sausage, for example, it just doesn't matter because the burn's going to get overwritten by your big burn, and this is all the damage that you need. The exception to this, a little off topic, but there is an exception to this, which is the Incendiary Turret from Engineer, either from the item or from a blue wrench. That burn actually does stack on top of regular burn, but otherwise only can have 1 burn source, so I would upgrade my primary burn source as high as possible, and then probably try to have my other weapons not inflicting burns so they wouldn't get in the way. So that's about it. Oh, and Taser. I think that's the last example I had. Taser is fantastic to upgrade because it actually gains projectiles. So it's similar to the Slingshot. That every upgrade will give it 1 extra Taser shot. So it's almost not losing anything from upgrades. You get an extra projectile, so it's almost like having an extra Taser. So yeah, it keeps a lot of its efficiency. Those I would consider to be tall weapons. Anything else with a bounce too? You know, we mentioned Slingshot, but Shuriken and Lightning Shiv also get bounces. They're in the same category. You know, there are some others. I'm just trying to give a few examples of weapons that are tall. But for other weapons that only gain like a damage increase, you can usually assume that it's going to give you about 30 to 35% effectiveness on the one weapon, and that it may not be like a huge priority compared to just building stats. Alright, on to some practical examples at last. I'll recommend a few characters and builds that you guys can use to win your first few runs in Brotato, or maybe you're trying to beat Danger 5. Either way, you know, that is one of the most frequently asked questions I get is, what character should I use to beat Danger 5? So this should address that question. And I'm going to be recommending these characters not necessarily based on their pure strength level. You know, this isn't a tier list. Although if you do want to see a tier list, post in the comments. I might do a character tier list. But this is really more about learning. You know, our goal is to learn, our goal is to get better, and be able to win on all the characters. So I'm going to recommend some characters that I think are good for building a skill set and taking that skill set to win with multiple other characters. And that is the primary goal here. So first character that I'll recommend is Crazy. Now, this guy is really strong. I think he's one of the strongest characters. But if you're just starting out, I don't think he necessarily feels that way. Because he has negative dodge, and you can't really dodge on Crazy. Now, if you wanted to, yeah, technically you can build enough dodge to overcome this minus, but that's really inefficient, so please don't do that. He can't dodge. You're gonna mostly focus on armor. Try to get 25-ish armor on him is a good kind of value to aim for. He also is a melee character. If you wanted to, you could build crossbows. He's not allowed to start with crossbow. But I would probably just play him as a melee character. All of these weapons are pretty short range by default. He gains 100 range, though, with the precise weapons. So it's a good character to start with because it's a focused build. You don't have to worry about any weapon type other than precise. You're only going to build precise. You're only going to build melee damage. Maybe in some builds you'll have a little bit of elemental for lightning shivs. But, you know, your stats are pretty straightforward. You build a lot of crit, because these weapons all want crit. If you're using the claw, you might build attack speed as well. But I would recommend just starting with Shuriken and building some melee damage, building some crit, building, you know, he starts with attack speed, so mostly damage percent over attack speed and armor, and those are basically your stats. And it's a good beginner character because it's simple, it's focused, and also he's kind of squishy, so you can't necessarily autopilot your way to victory, because you are gonna have to dodge, you know, and have somewhat good movement. It'll get used to melee without you being like in the middle of enemies. There are some other melee characters where if you have enough lifesteal and armor, you can kind of just sit in the middle of the wave. This guy can't do that. This guy actually has to move around, so I feel like he builds your skill set a little better than those other melee characters. And he does insane damage. Towards endgame, you're probably just going to melt the bosses if you build it right. So my usual build for crazy, I would recommend either Shuriken or Lightning Shiv. These both have the bounce. Remember, Lightning Shiv doesn't bounce unless it's close. You have to be close to the enemy to stab them, and then you get a bounce. Whereas Shuriken has a ton of range, and it's more like a ranged weapon where you can bounce from range. Either one's fine. I would probably take one of those as your main carry weapon, and then have like a couple of knives. Knife is a really good like get off me weapon for the big enemies. You want to have like one or two weapons that can deal insane damage to enemies that get close to you. So you've got like the Shuriken that's covering most of the little stuff, and then for the chargers that come in and get past your Shuriken wall, like the knife will take care of those. So that can be a good build. Second recommendation would be the Mage. He's not as strong. He's probably the weakest character that I'm going to recommend here. But he's very focused, because you know you're going to build Elemental on a Mage. Same thing as Crazy. And Burn, I think, is a good thing to get used to, because the enemies do stay alive a little bit longer. In a Mage build, you're usually going to have some tasers and Burn. That's the crux of the Mage build. And it gives you sort of, like Crazy, you're going to have to dodge a little bit, because the enemies will stay alive. The damage potential is very high, but you still have to dodge, so I think it builds your skill set. And again, not too many stats needed. You can see you can't even use a lot of these stats. So your stats are going to be pretty straightforward. You're going to take elemental damage, you're going to take attack speed, damage percent. Attack speed a little less important on Mage, by the way, because Burn does not stack. We mentioned that before. So if you have an enemy inflicted with Burn, you don't need to inflict it again. You know, having extra attack speed is only going to get you that extra, like in the Torch's case, that extra 50-50 hit on the initial hit. It's not going to actually add any burn, it'll only extend the burn duration. So for a Mage build, those are the stats. Pretty much just build elemental damage, damage percent, a lot higher than attack speed. But still a little bit of attack speed. Move speed, very important. Armor, dodge as much as you can. And that's going to be about it. As far as weapon selection, you can see that the Mage can start with guns. You might think that's kind of weird, but it's because he starts with the ability to inflict burn off of any of his hits with the Scared Sausage. Now, Scared Sausage burn is pretty weak, so I don't know if I would really recommend that. I have tried Gun Mage, and I think maybe my first Mage win was with Gun Mage, so it's possible you can do it. But because he can't use range damage, these guns are just going to hit like wet noodles, so I wouldn't really recommend that. I would say you want to either start with Wand or Torch. Maybe Wand is easier since it's pure ranged. And, you know, you can go Wand Taser. That's a pretty classic combo. For that build, you're going to want, if you see Sharp Bullets, it's a new white item that adds piercing to all of your projectiles, but actually gives you a damage penalty. It'll be on the screen. Why am I mentioning it? It's going to be on the screen here. I've got an editor. But it adds piercing to all your projectiles, which is really good for the Wand. It means you're going to be able to inflict burn on more enemies. And the minus damage does not apply to the burn. So you're just getting free burn. So yeah, I would look for that item, and also Bandana. I would look for those items with this build. And it's a pretty straightforward build. The Taser will make enemies slower, so you're kind of kiting enemies, running away from them. This is a very tall build, as in you're going to want to upgrade your weapons all the way. Wand is a burn weapon, so you know that it scales the burn damage by upgrading it. And Taser gains a lot of extra projectiles, so upgrading it's going increase the damage and also just increase your crowd control ability. So that's the mage. Those are my 2 recommendations for, if you're just getting into the game and you want to get your first win. Now for Danger 5, I think 2 of the strongest characters and the 2 that I would recommend are, first of all, the Generalist. I think it is the strongest character in the game. He doesn't really look like it if you just look at him. He gains melee damage for every range damage that he gets, and also vice versa, range damage for every melee. So he's a very straightforward character in that you're going to build a ton of melee and range damage, and that's it. Like anything, pretty much any item that says melee or range damage, you're going to buy it. And you're not going to buy a ton of weapon upgrades, because we mentioned earlier, the more flat damage you have, the worse weapon upgrades become. So this guy is just going to take, like, and his best weapons, by the way, are Cactus Club, since this has melee and range components. And SMG, because SMG has the highest, at least of these weapons. SMG has the highest range scaling of any of the starting weapons here. Revolver is also pretty high, but I haven't had a ton of success with the Revolver personally. You can try it. It's the numbers say that Revolver is quite good, but it doesn't have any native pierce, and it's kind of awkward because it has a really long cooldown. So I personally don't use it that much, but you could try. Laser Gun is another one. It's not, for some reason, it's not something you can start with, but Laser Gun also has really good scaling. So you could go for that one. Minigun, amazing if you find it. But yeah, basically 3 Cactus Clubs and then 3 of some kind of gun. Shotgun works too, whatever. 3 Cactus Clubs and 3 guns is going to be the go-to. Now he's really good even if you build spears. Like I built him with like any weapon. Any weapon works on this guy. Like he's actually broken. So I wouldn't worry too much about weapon selection, but if you just want to win, Cactus Club, SMG for sure. And yeah, his build is very straightforward. You take melee damage, you take range damage. It gets out of control. You don't have to upgrade your weapons at all. Like literally you win with 6 white weapons if you want to. 6 white or blue weapons is all you need. He can take, because of that lighter weapon upgrade requirement, he can take a lot of extra stats compared to other characters. So you're going to end up overstatted, and you're going to be one-shotting everything. It's going to be insane. So yeah, this guy would be my prime recommendation for your first Danger 5 win. I don't think he really builds your skill set the way the other characters do. I think he's just massively OP, so that's the reason I'm recommending him. And then the last character I'll recommend, who's also good for a Danger 5 win, is the Knight. This is a top-tier character. He gets +2 melee damage for every armor that he gains. So just like Generalist, the strategy is pretty straightforward, that you just want to build armor on him as high as you can. Just armor. Lifesteal is really good with armor, so you might want Lifesteal, although his attack speed tends to be kind of low. So, I don't know, some kind of healing. You're going to want some kind of healing on him, as well as really high armor. And for weapon selection, it doesn't matter too much, but just like Generalist, he's going to gain a ton of extra flat damage, so anything that scales well with flat damage works. You know, I would say Fist, but probably not. I mean, these weapons are all fine. You might think, by the way, the Spiky Shield is a really good choice, but it's not, because it doesn't scale at all with melee damage. You can look at the damage there. It only scales with armor, and his whole gimmick is that he gets extra melee damage for every armor. So anything with melee scaling is going to outperform the Spiky Shield on Knight. Spear's good. You know, the sword and hammer are good. Anything works. Torch is kind of weird because it doesn't scale with melee damage primarily. I would say these two are both a little bit weird. They only have 50% melee damage scaling, so probably would recommend Spear. It's a good go-to. But there are some weapons you can find that may be better. Again, Fist. I don't know. If you find a blue Fist, you might want to just like go in on that. But yeah, Spear's fine. Hatchet, maybe anything. Anything works. The reason why I like Knight as a recommendation, not only because he's strong, but also because, for the same reason as Crazy, actually, you're going to be focusing on armor rather than dodge. So you're not really like getting any RNG help in boss waves. All of your wins are going to come from like your natural movement ability and your armor damage mitigation. You're not gonna feel like you got lucky at any point, and that's nice for your first D5 win. So he teaches you movement more than, for example, a character like Ghost, who is all about dodge, and even if you suck, you might luck into a win with Ghost, but I don't feel like that's a good learning experience, you know. So I'm recommending Knight rather than Ghost for that reason. And yeah, I guess that would do it. That's two taters for winning on the easier difficulties, and 2 taters for winning on the harder difficulties. And for other recommendations, you'll have to stay tuned. I might make a tier list, might do some definitely we'll do some character guides. And let me know what you guys want. Let me know if I missed anything important in this guide, if there's still stuff that you want to know about. I am going to make that enemy wave guide, as well as specific character guides and kind of overall item guides. You know, that's the kind of thing that I'm looking at making. But if there's anything specific you want to see, or any specific character that you want to see in these character videos, please leave it in the comments or come by my Twitch stream. I am a Twitch streamer primarily, as you can tell by the fact that this video is incredibly long, and probably could have been condensed a little better. But I am primarily a Twitch streamer. You can head to twitch.tv/Celerity. We're going to be playing Brotato all through the first couple weeks of release, and probably for the long term. It's probably going to be a game that I'll play on my stream for years to come, every now and then. So, yeah, this game is great. It's enduring. Please stop by the stream and say hi. And again, leave any recommendations you have in the comments. I'll read everything and try to reply as best I can. All right, guys. Until next time. Stay awesome, and peace out.